For nearly 3 decades, one actor and one franchise have promised audiences somente no algoritmo, no digital double and no green screen. Coach Evil Full Deliver. Real Danger. Filmed for real, with a real human being ranging off a real airplane in 2025 that promise reach its final chapter. Mission Impossible. The final reckoning closes the story that begin with the age reckoning part 1. Seeding Ethan Hunt and is into the freezing waters of the Arctic to stop a huge artificial intelligence. Caleb the an entity before it reaches the truth of the entire world. This is a critical spoiler of one of cinema's last great practical action on sagas. Let's break down whether this mission which truly accomplished wedge.
There is something almost poetic about ending a franchise built on the idea of choosing to accept a mission with a story about a machine that removes the very idea of choice. That is the emotional and philosophical spine of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. The eighth and, according to almost everyone involved, final entry in a series that has run for 29 years with Tom Cruise as its unbreakable center. Directed once again by Christopher McQuarrie, who has now shaped the franchise's identity across for consecutive installments. This film had an enormous burden to carry. It needed to close the cliffhanger left by Dead Reckoning Part 1, resolve nearly 3 decades of accumulated mythology, deliver the kind of jaw-dropping physical stunt work the series is famous for, and somehow still function as a satisfying story on its own terms. That is an almost impossible task, which, fittingly, is the entire point of the title. The premise picks up directly where the previous film left off. Ethan Hunt and the impossible mission force are racing against a self-aware, self-replicating artificial intelligence known only as the Entity, a digital being that has infiltrated global networks, corrupted intelligence agencies, and made truth itself an unstable, negotiable thing. The Entity's ultimate goal is chillingly simple and terrifyingly modern: total control over information, and therefore total control over reality. Whoever controls the source code controls what billions of people believe to be true. In the world of this film, nuclear codes, satellite systems, financial markets, and even the footage we see with our own eyes can all be manipulated by an intelligence that never sleeps and never stops learning. The team's goal is to locate the drowned Russian submarine Sevastopol, sunk in the Bering Sea, which holds the original, uncorrupted core of the Entity, sometimes called the source code or the poison pill that could be used to destroy it for good. To get there, Ethan is forced into an uneasy dynamic with Gabriel, a former operative of the very organization that built the Entity. a man from Ethan's own buried past who now acts as the entity's human agent in the physical world. Gabriel is less a traditional villain and more a symptom of the film's larger threat. A person who has decided that serving something bigger and colder than himself is easier than living with human uncertainty. Around Ethan, the film assembles a returning ensemble that feels less like a cast list and more like a family reunion. Grace, the skilled thief turned reluctant ally introduced in the previous film, has become fully embedded in the team. Luther Stickel, Ethan's oldest Vernations of the entire saga, is present once more, carrying the weight of decades of shared history. Benji Dunn provides both technical support and comic relief, though his role in this entry leans more heavily into vulnerability than jokes. New additions like Theo and the submarine specialist to go widen the ensemble, while figures like Paris and longtime IMF handle Kittredge's texture to a mythology that has, by this point, become genuinely dense. What makes this recap section of the analysis worth dwelling on is not simply cataloguing names, but noticing what the film is trying to say through its structure. Nearly every character in the final reckoning represents a different relationship to trust. Ethan trusts almost no one fully except Luther and Grace, and even those bonds are tested by the stakes of the mission. Gabriel trusts nothing except the cold logic of survival. The entity, by definition, trusts nothing at all. Because trust requires vulnerability, and a machine that can rewrite its own code has no need to be vulnerable. Placing a story about radical, embodied, human trust inside a plot about an intelligence that manipulates trust at a planetary scale is, frankly, a clever piece of structural writing, even if the film does not always execute that idea with the elegance it deserves. The most talked about sequence, and rightly so, involves Ethan diving into the wreck of the Sevastopol, a submarine resting at a steep, disorienting angle on the ocean floor, filled with shifting debris, live torpedoes, and zero margin for error. The sequence, filmed using enormous underwater tanks and painstaking practical set design, is a masterclass in tension built almost entirely without dialogue. There is no techno-jargon explaining what Ethan needs to do. There is only geometry, gravity, and the audience's own held breath. It recalls the best silent cinema tradition of physical peril, where the visual information itself tells the story. Cruise, now in his 60s, performs much of this underwater work himself, holding his breath for stretches that would challenge professional freedivers half his age. Whatever criticisms one might level at the film's script, this sequence alone justifies the price of admission, because it captures something modern blockbuster filmmaking has mostly abandoned: the unmistakable feeling that what you are watching is actually happening to an actual person. The second signature set piece, a mid-air battle involving a biplane over rugged terrain, functions as this film's answer to the helicopter chase of Fallout or the train sequence of Dead Reckoning. It is spectacular, technically dazzling, and clearly the product of extraordinary planning and physical risk. And yet, compared to the submarine sequence, it feels slightly more conventional, more indebted to aerial combat films that came before it. This is not a criticism of craft, because the execution is flawless. It is a note on originality, because by the time this film arrives, audiences have watched Ethan Hunt climb the Burj Khalifa, cling to the outside of a departing airplane, ride a motorcycle off a cliff, and hang from a helicopter over a canyon. The law of diminishing returns starts to apply not because the stunts get less dangerous, but because our capacity for astonishment has a ceiling, and this franchise has spent 8 films pushing against it. Structurally, this is where the film invites its most consistent criticism. The story spends a significant portion of its runtime on exposition, explaining what the entity has done, what it plans to do next, how the team intends to stop it, and reminding the audience of events from the previous film through flashbacks and flash-forwards. For longtime fans who watched Dead Reckoning Part 1 in 2023, some of this repetition feels unnecessary. A kind of narrative handholding that slows the momentum right when the story should be accelerating toward its climax. For newer viewers, or those catching up after a gap, this same exposition may feel more forgivable, even necessary. Given how many plot threads the film needs to gather before it can pay them off, it is a difficult balance to strike in any franchise finale, and the final reckoning does not always strike it gracefully. There are stretches, particularly in the film's first half, where characters explain plans to other characters who already understand those plans, seemingly for the benefit of the audience rather than the internal logic of the scene. This pacing issue connects to a broader critique that has followed the film since its earliest reviews. The dialogue, in places, feels overwritten and self-serious. Characters deliver speeches about legacy, sacrifice, and the meaning of choice with a gravity that occasionally tips into melodrama. Earlier entries in this saga, particularly Fallout and Rogue Nation, understood the value of restraint, letting action and glances carry emotional weight instead of monologues. The final reckoning, perhaps because it knows it is the end, seems anxious about making sure the audience understands the stakes, the history, and the emotional significance of every moment. That anxiety sometimes undercuts the very tension it is trying to build. A quieter, more confident script might have trusted its audience, and its own 29 years of accumulated goodwill, to feel the weight of the ending without being told, repeatedly, how heavy that weight is supposed to be. And yet, for all of its structural stumbles, the film's emotional through-line lands with genuine force, largely because of the cast's total commitment to the material. Tom Cruise plays Ethan Hunt here not as an invincible action hero, but as a man keenly aware of his own mortality, both literally and symbolically. There are moments where the film seems to be commenting on Cruise himself, on an actor who has spent decades performing his own stunts specifically because he believes cinema loses something essential when it stops showing us real human bodies doing real, dangerous things. Whether or not that philosophy is one the audience shares, it gives the film a strange, sincere authenticity that is almost impossible to fake. When Ethan hesitates before jumping, climbing, or diving, you sense that hesitation is not just written into the script. It is a reflection of an actor who understands exactly how much is at risk, physically, every single time the cameras roll. The supporting performances mostly rise to meet that sincerity. The chemistry between Ethan and Grace has matured since the previous film, moving from wary partnership into something closer to genuine trust, though the film wisely avoids forcing that relationship into simple romance. Luther's arc, without spoiling specifics, carries the emotional core of the entire saga. Because his character has always represented loyalty without condition, the one person Ethan never has to convince. Benji's journey pushes him out of his usual comfort zone as comic relief and into moments of real physical and emotional stakes, giving the character and the actor playing him room to do something different after multiple films of largely similar beats. Simon Pegg handles this shift well, finding sincerity without losing the character's essential warmth. As an antagonist, Gabriel occupies an interesting but somewhat underdeveloped space in the story. He is meant to represent the human cost of surrendering agency to something larger than oneself. A cautionary mirror held up against Ethan's stubborn insistence on personal choice and personal responsibility. In theory, this makes him one of the more thematically rich villains in the franchise's history. In practice, the film does not always give him enough screen time or enough interiority to fully land that theme. He functions well as a physical threat, someone capable of matching Ethan in combat and cunning, but his ideological motivations remain somewhat sketched in rather than fully explored. This is a common critique of the film, and a fair one, The human villain, ironically, ends up feeling less fully realized than the invisible, disembodied artificial intelligence he serves. The entity itself, meanwhile, might be the film's most successful creative choice, precisely because it refuses easy visualization. Unlike so many cinematic depictions of rogue AI, which tend to give the technology a face, a voice, or a humanoid robotic body, the entity remains something closer to atmosphere, a presence felt through flickering screens, corrupted footage, manipulated audio, and a creeping sense that nothing on any device can be trusted. This choice makes the villain genuinely unsettling in a way few blockbuster antagonists manage, because it taps directly into a real and growing anxiety in contemporary life. Audiences in 2025 do not need much imagination to understand a threat built on the idea that video, audio, and data can all be faked, convincingly enough to fool governments and individuals alike. The film is, in this sense, less science fiction than slightly exaggerated reportage. And that grounding in real-world entities is part of why the entity, despite lacking a face, feels like the most dangerous character in the entire saga. It is worth pausing here to talk about direction and craft. Because whatever the screenplay's shortcomings, Christopher McQuarrie's control of tone, geography, and tension remains remarkable. Across his four films in this franchise, McQuarrie has developed a directorial signature built on clarity, no matter how elaborate the stunt work becomes. The audience almost always understands exactly where characters are, what they are trying to do, and what will happen if they fail. This clarity is not a small achievement in an era where many action blockbusters rely on rapid, cutting, and shaky camera work to disguise weaker choreography. The final reckoning, particularly in its submarine sequence, favors longer takes, wide framing, and patient camera movement that lets the audience actually see the danger rather than merely infer it from editing tricks. The directorial patience is, in many ways, the franchise's greatest and most consistent virtue. And it remains intact here even when the script around it wavers. The cinematography leans into cold, desaturated tones for the Arctic and underwater sequences, contrasting sharply with warmer, more golden palettes used in flashback material and quieter character scenes. This visual language reinforces the film's central metaphor without needing a single line of dialogue to explain it. Warmth represents human connection and memory, while the cold represents the mechanical, indifferent threat of the entity and the frozen wasteland where its physical remnants lie hidden. It is a simple piece of visual storytelling, but an effective one, and it demonstrates the kind of confidence the screenplay itself sometimes lacks. Lorne Balfe's musical score deserves specific mention as well, rather than leaning entirely on the franchise's iconic theme, which appears at carefully chosen, almost ceremonial moments. The score for this film often strips itself down to minimal, pulsing textures during the quietest and most tense sequences, allowing silence and breath sounds to do dramatic work that music usually claims for itself. Then, at key emotional peaks, the familiar theme swells in full. And after 8 films and 29 years, that motif still manages to produce a genuine surge of feeling. Franchise fatigue is real, and sequel exhaustion is a documented phenomenon in modern cinema. Yet there is something about hearing that specific melody one final time, attached to a story that so clearly intends to be a farewell. That lands emotionally regardless of any script-level criticism. Editing is another area where the film shows clear craftsmanship, even if pacing overall draws criticism. Action sequences are cut with a rhythm that respects geography and physical logic, never sacrificing spatial clarity for sheer speed. Where the editing struggles is in the connective tissue between action set pieces. The scenes of exposition and planning that, as mentioned earlier, sometimes repeat information or slow momentum unnecessarily. A tighter edit in these connective scenes Trimming perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of dialogue-heavy explanation might have resulted in a leaner, more consistently gripping film. At its current runtime, one of the longest in the franchise's history. Sci-Fi. Reckoning asks a great deal of patience from its audience before rewarding that patience with its most extraordinary sequences. Turning to reception, critical response upon release was largely positive but noticeably more divided than for the previous two entries. Critics widely praised the physical stunt work, the technical filmmaking, Cruise's committed performance, and the emotional weight the film brings to closing out nearly 3 decades of storytelling. At the same time, a significant number of reviews pointed to exactly the issue discussed above: exposition, uneven pacing and underwritten central villain, and dialogue that occasionally tips into overwrought sentimentality. Audience response skewed even more favorably than critical response, suggesting that longtime fans of the series were more willing to forgive structural flaws in exchange for a satisfying, sentimental send-off to characters they have followed for years. This split between critical and audience reaction is common for legacy franchise finales. Think of how audiences and critics diverged on the emotional conclusions of other long-running sagas, where nostalgia and emotional investment can outweigh strict narrative discipline. Commercially, the film arrived with one of the largest budgets in the franchise's history, reportedly combined with its predecessor into a production cost that ranks among the most expensive filmmaking undertakings ever attempted, driven largely by the demands of practical stunt work, international location shooting, and specialized underwater set construction. Its opening weekend box office, while strong, reflected the increasingly challenging theatrical marketplace for original, non-franchise adjacent blockbusters, even one as beloved as this. The film performed respectably against stiff holiday competition, though industry analysts noted that recouping such an enormous budget would require sustained, front-loaded international performance rather than the kind of long theatrical tale that older franchise entries once enjoyed. Whether or not the film reached its most ambitious financial targets, its cultural conversation, driven by genuine astonishment at its practical stunts, kept it firmly in the center of moviegoing discourse throughout its release window, placing this film within the broader context of the mission. Impossible Saga reveals just how far the series has traveled since its 1996 origins as a fairly straightforward espionage thriller loosely based on the television show. Over 8 films and multiple directors, the franchise gradually transformed from a story about a spy team completing individual missions into a serialized, mythology-heavy saga about one man's relationship to duty, sacrifice, and the people he refuses to abandon. Brian De Palma's original film prioritized paranoia and plot twists. John Woo's sequel leaned into operatic stylization. J.J. Abrams introduced serialized emotional stakes with Ethan's personal relationships. Brad Bird pushed the series toward pure, joyful spectacle. And McQuarrie, across his 4-film run beginning with Rogue Nation, fused all of these earlier approaches into something more consistent, grounded, character-driven, physically authentic action filmmaking that still allows for moments of genuine wit and warmth. The final reckoning represents the culmination of that specific McQuarrie approach, for better and occasionally for worse, carrying both its greatest strengths and its most persistent weaknesses to their furthest extreme. One of the more fascinating aspects of watching this film as a conclusion is considering what impossible has actually meant across the franchise's history. In earlier films, spy missions were prendre un infiltratant impénétrable, steal a list of secret identities, prevent a terrorist attack using stolen nuclear material. The stakes were high but comprehensible, human-scaled even when they threatened cities or countries. By the time the story reaches the final reckoning, the impossible mission has become almost metaphysical, preventing an artificial intelligence from redefining the nature of truth itself. This is a much harder kind of impossible to dramatize, because it lacks the clear physical geometry of a bomb that needs defusing or a vault that needs cracking. The film's attempt to translate this abstract, informational threat into concrete physical stakes. Submarines, wreckage, coordinates, keys, is admirable and mostly successful, but it also explains some of the narrative strain critics have noted. Fighting an idea is much harder to stage than fighting a person. And the film's best moments occur precisely when it manages to make the abstract fight feel physical and immediate, as in the submarine dive. And its weaker moments occur when it tries to explain that fight through dialogue instead. There is also something worth saying about how this film handles the theme of legacy, both narratively and as a piece of cultural commentary on Tom Cruise's own career. Ethan Hunt has, across 8 films, buried friends, lost lovers, sacrificed personal happiness, and repeatedly chosen the safety of the world over his own well-being. The Final Reckoning treats this accumulated history not as background trivia for superfans, but as the emotional engine of the entire story. Characters reference past missions, past losses, and past choices. And the film asks, quite directly, whether a life defined entirely by sacrifice can ever really end, or whether the person living that life becomes so defined by duty that ordinary retirement is simply impossible for them, in every sense of the word. This question resonates beyond the fiction, given how thoroughly Tom Cruise's real public persona has become intertwined with Ethan Hunt's fictional one. Watching a 60-something actor perform stunts that would be dangerous for a stunt performer in their 20s inevitably colors the film's meditations on aging, mortality, and the refusal to stop. The movie seems aware of this parallel and leans into it rather than shying away, which gives certain quieter scenes an unexpectedly poignant, almost documentary-adjacent weight. Where the film falters most consistently is in balancing this thematic ambition with narrative economy. A leaner script, trusting its action sequences and its cast chemistry to carry emotional weight, rather than repeatedly stating that weight through dialogue, would likely have resulted in a tighter, more purely satisfying film. Compare this to Fallout, widely considered by critics and fans alike to be the franchise's high point, which achieved similar emotional stakes through action and character behavior far more than through speeches. The Final Reckoning occasionally forgets that lesson, mistaking explanation for depth. It is a film that, in its best moments, shows rather than tells, and in its more uneven stretches, tells when it should be showing. Still, it would be unfair to let structural criticism overshadow just how technically extraordinary this film is as a piece of physical filmmaking. In an industry increasingly reliant on digital de-aging, virtual sets, and computer-generated stunt doubles, The Final Reckoning stands as a genuine outlier, a film that insists, sequence after sequence, on showing audiences something real. The submarine dive alone represents an extraordinary achievement in production design, stunt choreography, and sheer physical endurance from its lead actor. Few, if any, other active blockbuster franchises are attempting anything close to this level of practical commitment. And that commitment is precisely why audiences keep returning to this series even as competing franchises increasingly blur into indistinguishable digital spectacle. Whatever else can be said about pacing or dialogue, nobody leaves this film doubting that what they watched involved genuine risk to genuine human beings. And in 2025's blockbuster landscape, that alone makes it a rare and valuable thing. As a series finale, or at least the strong possibility of one, the film mostly succeeds at giving its characters meaningful closure without descending into fan service for its own sake. Long-time relationships are honored rather than simply referenced. Sacrifices carry weight because the film has spent nearly 3 decades earning them. Across 8 movies and countless hours of accumulated audience investment, the ending, without spoiling specifics, resists the temptation toward an overly tidy, saccharine resolution, instead finding a note that feels earned, bittersweet, and appropriately reflective of everything Ethan Hunt has given up along the way. This is, ultimately, a story about choice, about the difference between a life dictated by fate, algorithm, or inherited duty, and a life defined by the small, difficult, human decisions made in the space between impossible odds. The film's insistence on human agency as its ultimate answer to the cold logic of artificial intelligence is not a subtle theme. But it is a sincere one, and sincerity carries real weight in a marketplace increasingly crowded with cynical franchise extensions. It is worth slowing down here to look more closely at the individual members of the team, because one of the quiet strengths of this film, and of the franchise as a whole, is how much personality each supporting character carries even when the plot machinery around them grows complicated. Grace, introduced as a resourceful pickpocket and con artist caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, has by this point completed a genuinely satisfying arc, from reluctant outsider to trusted operative. What makes her journey work is that the film never strips away the qualities that made her interesting in the first place. She remains quick-witted, self-reliant, and a little skeptical of institutions, even as she becomes fully integrated into the IMF's tightly bonded family. Her dynamic with Ethan avoids the tired mentor and protege shorthand that so many action franchises fall back on, instead reading more like to people who have independently decided that trusting each other is the only rational response to an irrational, dangerous world. Benji Dunn's arc deserves particular attention, because after appearing in every film since Ghost Protocol, the character has settled into a role that could easily have become static. The nervous tech specialist who provides comic relief and occasional gadget exposition. The final reckoning wisely pushes against that comfort zone, placing Benji in situations of genuine physical danger and emotional stakes that force both the character and Simon Pegg's performance to reach for something deeper than the reliable jokes of earlier entries. There is a vulnerability to Benji in this film that pays off nearly 15 years of audience familiarity with the character. And it is one of the more quietly effective pieces of long-form character writing in the entire saga. Luther Stickle occupies a unique position in the mythology, having appeared alongside Ethan since the very first film in 1996. Ving Rhames brings a weathered gravity to the role that the screenplay leans on heavily, using Luther as a kind of emotional anchor whenever the plot threatens to spiral into pure spectacle. Every scene between Ethan and Luther in this film carries the accumulated weight of nearly 3 decades of shared missions. And the film trusts that history enough to let their scenes breathe, favoring quiet dialogue and meaningful glances over the exposition-heavy tendencies that mark some of the film's other sequences. If there is a through line of restraint anywhere in this screenplay, it lives in the scenes between these two actors, and it stands as some of the strongest writing in the entire film. Kittredge, the IMF director whose relationship with Ethan has oscillated between adversarial and reluctantly cooperative across multiple films, returns here in a role that reflects the franchise's long-running interest in institutional distrust. From the very first film, which famously reveals that the IMF's own leadership orchestrated a conspiracy against Ethan, this series has maintained a healthy skepticism toward centralized authority, government bureaucracy, and the idea that any single institution can be fully trusted with unchecked power. That skepticism finds its most literal expression yet in a story about an artificial intelligence born from exactly that kind of institutional overreach. A program built by governments seeking strategic advantage that inevitably escapes their control. Kittredge's presence in the story serves as a reminder that human institutions, for all their flaws, at least remain accountable to human consequences in a way that a self-improving, disembodied algorithm never can be. The newer additions to the ensemble, including the submarine specialist, Digger, and other supporting operatives introduced across the two-part Dead Reckoning and Final Reckoning story, function primarily as connective tissue, providing technical expertise the plot requires while also representing a broader, more geographically and professionally diverse IMF than the franchise depicted in its earlier decades. This expansion of the team reflects a thoughtful, if sometimes underexplored, acknowledgement that modern intelligence and technical work increasingly requires specialists beyond the traditional spy archetype, engineers, hackers, submariners, and analysts whose skills matter just as much as hand-to-hand combat training. The film does not always give these characters enough time to become fully three-dimensional, but their presence enriches the sense that the IMF and the fight against the entity requires an entire ecosystem of talent rather than a single heroic figure. Turning back to craft, it is worth examining the film's sound design in more detail, because much of its most effective tension is built not through music or dialogue, but through the careful, deliberate use of silence and ambient noise. The submarine sequence in particular strips away almost all score for extended stretches, replacing it with the groan of metal under pressure, the distant thud of shifting debris, and the increasingly labored sound of Ethan's own breath. This choice forces the audience into a kind of visceral, embodied tension that no amount of orchestral scoring could replicate, and it demonstrates a level of confidence in pure sound craft that few modern action films are willing to attempt. Sound design of this caliber rarely receives the same critical attention as cinematography or stunt work, but it deserves recognition here as one of the film's most quietly sophisticated achievements. Production design across the film also merits specific praise, particularly in how it visually distinguishes the cold, mechanical world of the entity's influence from the warmer, more tactile world of human relationships and physical spaces. The wreck of the Sevastopol itself, rendered through a combination of massive practical tank work and careful set dressing, feels genuinely aged, waterlogged, and dangerous in a way that computer-generated environments rarely achieve. Costume design, to quietly reinforces character arcs. Ethan's wardrobe grows increasingly stripped down and utilitarian as the story progresses, shedding the polished tailoring of earlier scenes in favor of practical gear suited to genuine physical hardship. A subtle visual metaphor for a character shedding pretense and comfort in favor of pure, essential purpose. Placing this film alongside its 7 predecessors reveals just how much the franchise has evolved in tone and ambition. The original 1996 film, directed by Brian De Palma, was a comparatively small, paranoid thriller built around a single, devastating betrayal and a handful of tightly constructed set pieces. Most famously the vault heist, that remains one of the most influential sequences in modern action cinema. John Woo's 2000 sequel embraced a very different, more operatic sensibility, full of slow-motion doves, stylized gunplay, and a romantic subplot that many fans consider the franchise's most divisive entry, J.J. Abrams' 2006 film. Mission Impossible 3 marked a significant tonal shift, introducing Ethan's wife and grounding the character in genuine emotional stakes for the first time. Alongside a villain performance widely regarded as one of the series' best, Brad Bird's Ghost Protocol, released in 2011, reinvented the franchise as pure kinetic joy, epitomized by its now iconic Burj Khalifa sequence, and remains a fan favorite for its perfect balance of humor, spectacle, and heart. From Rogue Nation onward, Christopher McQuarrie's steady hand has given the series a consistent identity that it lacked in its earlier, more directorially varied years. Rogue Nation introduced a level of narrative complexity and thematic ambition, exploring the consequences of unchecked intelligence agencies. That laid the groundwork for the more serialized storytelling to come. Fallout, released in 2018 and still widely regarded as the franchise's creative peak, achieved a near-perfect balance between emotionally grounded character work and jaw-dropping physical stunts, including the Halo jump and helicopter chase sequences that remain touchstones for the genre. Dead Reckoning Part 1 introduced the entity as an antagonist and expanded the mythology into genuinely serialized, two-part storytelling for the first time in the franchise's history. A structural gamble that not every fan embraced, but one that set the stage for the ambitious scope of this final chapter. Seen against this history, the final reckoning represents both the logical endpoint and the heaviest possible burden for a franchise finale to carry. It must honor the paranoid, institution-distrusting DNA of the original film, the emotional stakes introduced by Abrams, the pure spectacle perfected by Bird, and the serialized, thematically ambitious storytelling McQuarrie himself introduced across his four-film tenure. That it manages to gesture toward all of these legacies, even imperfectly, speaks to a genuine ambition rarely found in modern franchise filmmaking, where finales too often settle for safe nostalgia rather than genuine narrative risk. It is also worth situating the film's central anxiety, an artificial intelligence capable of manipulating truth at a planetary scale, within the broader cultural moment of its release. Arriving in a world increasingly concerned with generative artificial intelligence, deepfake technology, and the erosion of shared, verifiable fact. The entity functions as more than a simple science fiction threat. It operates as a heightened, dramatized version of anxieties many audiences already carry into the theater. This grounding in contemporary unease gives the film's stakes an unusually immediate resonance compared to earlier, more traditionally espionage-focused entries in the series, where villains sought nuclear codes or classified lists rather than control over reality itself. Whether or not every viewer consciously registers this parallel, it likely contributes to why the entity, despite its abstract, faceless nature, lands as a genuinely unsettling antagonist rather than a vague, forgettable plot device. Critical reception, when examined in more detail, reveals an interesting pattern worth unpacking. Early reviews out of the film's festival premiere skewed strongly positive, with praise concentrated almost entirely on technical achievement, physical stunt work, and the emotional resonance of watching this specific cast close out a shared, decades-long story. As wider release reviews accumulated, the aggregate critical score settled into a more moderate range. Still solidly positive, but noticeably lower than the near-universal acclaim received by Fallout or Rogue Nation. The specific criticisms that recurred most often across professional reviews centered on runtime, an overstuffed and occasionally repetitive plot structure, and a villain in Gabriel who never quite achieves the menace or complexity of earlier franchise antagonists. At the same time, audience scores remain consistently higher than critical scores throughout the release window, a gap that suggests general moviegoers, particularly longtime fans invested in these specific characters, were more forgiving of structural imperfections in exchange for emotional payoff and technical spectacle. This critic-audience divide is not unique to this film, but it does illuminate something important about how franchise finales are experienced differently depending on a viewer's relationship to the material. A critic evaluating the film purely as a standalone piece of screenwriting will naturally weigh its exposition-heavy stretches and underdeveloped villain more harshly than a longtime fan who arrives already emotionally invested in Ethan, Luther, and Benji, and who therefore experiences even imperfect scenes involving these characters as meaningful rather than indulgent. Neither reading is wrong. They simply reflect different frameworks for evaluating a film that is simultaneously a standalone action movie and the culmination of a 29-year narrative and emotional investment for its most devoted audience. Financially, the film's enormous production budget, reportedly among the largest ever committed to a single production when combined with its predecessor's costs, reflects the genuine expense of practical, large-scale stunt filmmaking in an era where digital alternatives are typically far cheaper. This budget places significant pressure on box office performance, particularly in a theatrical marketplace that has grown increasingly cautious about big-budget original or franchise-adjacent releases outside of a handful of guaranteed tentpole properties. The film's opening weekend performance, while respectable and competitive against strong holiday weekend competition, illustrated both the continued strength of the Mission Impossible brand and the broader challenges facing even beloved franchises in recouping enormous production costs through theatrical release alone, particularly as international markets and streaming windows increasingly factor into a film's overall financial calculus, regardless of where final worldwide grosses ultimately landed. The film's cultural footprint, driven by genuine astonishment at its stunt work and extensive media coverage of Cruise's death-defying commitment to practical filmmaking, ensured it remained part of the broader cultural conversation throughout its theatrical run and beyond. It is also worth considering how this film handles franchise mythology for viewers who may not have followed every prior installment closely. Unlike many long-running franchises that assume near-total audience familiarity with years of accumulated lore, The Final Reckoning attempts, not always gracefully, to re-explain key relationships and plot points for viewers who might be arriving fresh or returning after a gap. This instinct is understandable given the film's ambition to serve as a definitive, accessible conclusion rather than a niche continuation aimed solely at devoted fans. However, this same instinct contributes directly to the pacing and exposition criticisms discussed earlier, creating a genuine tension between accessibility and narrative efficiency that the film never fully resolves. A version of this story trimmed by 20 minutes, trusting audience familiarity a bit more aggressively, might have satisfied longtime fans more consistently while still remaining comprehensible to newcomers, through visual storytelling and character behavior rather than dialogue-heavy recaps. Beyond plot mechanics, the film also invites reflection on what a fitting ending actually looks like for a franchise built so heavily around escalating physical spectacle. There is an inherent tension in ending a series famous for ever-increasing stunts with a conclusion that must, by definition, be the largest and most dangerous entry yet, while also needing to feel emotionally conclusive rather than merely bigger for its own sake. The film navigates this tension reasonably well by ensuring its most spectacular sequences, the submarine dive above all, serve direct narrative and thematic purposes rather than existing purely as spectacle for spectacle's sake. The dive is not simply the biggest stunt the franchise could imagine. It is a literal, physical manifestation of Ethan descending into danger, isolation, and uncertainty to retrieve something that can restore stability and truth to a world the entity has thrown into chaos. That symbolic weight elevates the sequence beyond pure technical achievement, even as the technical achievement itself remains extraordinary on its own terms. There is a broader industry conversation worth folding into this analysis, because the choices made throughout this film, and throughout Macquarie and Cruise's collaboration more generally, carry implications well beyond this single release. Over the past decade, mainstream action and superhero cinema has increasingly relied on digital stunt doubles, virtual production techniques, and post-production de-aging to achieve spectacle without the same degree of physical risk or logistical complexity that defined earlier eras of filmmaking. This shift has produced genuine benefits, including improved safety for stunt performers and expanded, creative possibilities for sequences that would be physically impossible to film practically. But it has also, according to many critics and filmmakers, produced a certain visual weightlessness. A sense that consequences within these films are ultimately negotiable because the underlying footage itself is infinitely malleable. The Mission Impossible franchise, and this film in particular, stands as a deliberate, almost stubborn counterargument to that industry trend, insisting that audiences can still feel the difference between manufactured and genuine physical risk, even if they cannot always articulate exactly why a sequence feels more thrilling. Whether or not this philosophy remains commercially sustainable as production costs continue climbing is an open question the industry will likely continue debating long after this film's theatrical run concludes. But as a statement of artistic intent, The Final Reckoning represents one of the clearest, most fully realized expressions of that philosophy ever committed to screen. This commitment to practical filmmaking also shapes the film's relationship with its own visual effects work, which, while extensive, functions primarily in service of enhancing and extending practical elements rather than replacing them entirely. Digital work in this film handles environmental extension, safety wire removal, and the kind of invisible technical polish that most effective visual effects work has always provided, rather than generating entire action sequences from scratch. This distinction matters enormously to how the film feels in motion. Audiences may not consciously register the difference between a fully computer-generated stunt and a practical one enhanced with digital cleanup. But decades of research into audience engagement and physiological response suggest that viewers register genuine tension differently when they sense, even unconsciously, that real stakes underlie what they are watching. This is likely part of why the submarine sequence, despite containing digital elements, still produces the visceral, breath-holding tension that purely computer-generated underwater sequences in other franchises rarely achieve. Turning to a theme that runs quietly beneath the surface of the entire film, it is worth examining how The Final Reckoning handles the question of determinism versus free will, a philosophical tension embedded directly in its marketing tagline about lives being the sum of our choices. The entity, as a villain, essentially argues a kind of technological determinism that with sufficient data and sufficient processing power, human behavior becomes predictable, and prediction becomes control. Gabriel's arc represents the human embodiment of surrendering to that deterministic worldview, choosing to believe that resistance against an all-knowing system is ultimately futile, and that alignment with power, however cold or inhuman that power might be, represents the only rational path forward. Ethan's entire character, by contrast, has always represented the opposite conviction, that even against overwhelming odds, even when a mission is labeled impossible by every rational calculation, human choice and human improvisation retain the power to change outcomes that seem predetermined. This philosophical tension, while not always articulated with total subtlety in the script, gives the film's central conflict a thematic weight beyond simple action spectacle, positioning this finale as fundamentally a story about the value of human unpredictability in a world increasingly optimized, categorized, and predicted by algorithmic systems. It is also worth acknowledging how the franchise has handled its female characters across this concluding chapter, an area where the series has shown gradual but real improvement over nearly 3 decades. Early entries in the franchise, particularly the second and third films, tended to position female characters primarily as romantic interests or narrative motivation for Ethan's actions, with limited agency of their own, beginning with Rogue Nation's introduction of a morally complex, highly capable operative working her own angles independent of Ethan. The franchise began correcting course And that trajectory continues meaningfully in this final chapter. Grace operates with clear agency, her own motivations, and skills that meaningfully contribute to the team's success rather than existing purely as an object of protection or romantic interest. This evolution reflects broader changes across the action genre over the past decade. And while the franchise's earlier entries cannot be retroactively rewritten, it is worth noting that its concluding chapter reflects a more thoughtful, equitable approach to its ensemble than its origins might have suggested was possible. Returning to the film's pacing challenges with a bit more specificity, it is useful to note exactly where the momentum most consistently sags. The opening section, which reestablishes the entity's global threat and reconnects audiences with the ensemble following. The previous film's cliffhanger runs notably longer than comparable setup sections in earlier franchise entries. Several scenes here cover similar thematic ground, reinforcing the stakes of the entity's threat through multiple conversations rather than trusting a single, well-constructed sequence to establish the danger definitively. A more economical approach, consolidating this repeated thematic material into fewer, more impactful scenes, would likely have addressed much of the pacing criticism that has followed the film since release, without sacrificing any of its emotional or thematic ambition. This is ultimately a matter of screenplay discipline rather than conceptual weakness. The ideas underlying this section of the film are sound, but their execution occasionally overstays its welcome. By contrast, once the film's midpoint arrives, and the team's plan crystallizes around locating and infiltrating the Sevastopol, momentum builds steadily and rarely falters again. This structural imbalance, a slower, more expository first half, followed by a tightly constructed, relentlessly tense back half, is common enough in blockbuster filmmaking that it likely will not surprise seasoned moviegoers. But it does mean that patience is genuinely required before the film delivers on its most extraordinary sequences. For audiences willing to extend that patience, the payoff is substantial. For those expecting the more consistently kinetic pacing of Fallout or Ghost Protocol from the opening frame, the first half may test their engagement more than they anticipated going in. It is also worth briefly addressing how this film functions as a piece of populist filmmaking within an increasingly fragmented media landscape, where shared theatrical experiences have become rarer and more precious. Regardless of any individual criticism levied against its screenplay, the final reckoning represents exactly the kind of large-scale, communal moviegoing event that theatrical distribution increasingly struggles to sustain outside of a handful of guaranteed franchises. Watching an audience gasp collectively during the submarine sequence, or applaud spontaneously during the film's climactic action beats, speaks to something valuable about communal cinema that streaming first releases rarely replicate. Whatever this film's flaws, its ability to generate that kind of collective in-theater response places it among a shrinking category of films, still capable of drawing large audiences specifically for the shared experience of watching something extraordinary unfold on the biggest possible screen. Finally, before reaching a concluding verdict, it is worth reflecting on how this film handles its emotional farewell to Ethan Hunt specifically, separate from broader franchise mythology or thematic ambition, without spoiling the specifics of how the story resolves. The film consistently prioritizes emotional honesty over triumphant spectacle in its final stretch, understanding that a genuinely satisfying ending for this character requires acknowledging the accumulated cost of a life built entirely around impossible missions, rather than simply celebrating one final victory. This choice, favoring reflection over pure triumph, represents perhaps the film's most mature and successful screenwriting decision, even amid the pacing and exposition issues discussed throughout this analysis. It suggests a filmmaking team keenly aware that the true emotional stakes of a franchise finale rest not in whether the hero survives one more mission, but in what surviving that mission has actually cost him across nearly 3 decades of choosing, again and again, to accept the impossible. One last angle worth exploring before wrapping up is how this film treats trust between allies as its own form of quiet action. Choreography, distinct from the physical stunts that dominate discussion of the series. Throughout the story, plans go wrong constantly. Communications get cut. And characters are forced to improvise based on limited information and instinct built from years of working together. The film stages several sequences where success depends entirely on one character trusting another's judgment without full information, a kind of trustful built into the plotting itself. This recurring structural choice mirrors the franchise's larger thesis about human connection as the ultimate counterweight to cold, isolated, algorithmic control. A machine like the entity can calculate probabilities, but it cannot replicate the specific, earned trust between people who have repeatedly risked their lives for one another. Watching that trust play out mission after mission, even in a film burdened by pacing issues, remains genuinely moving, because it is built on nearly 3 decades of accumulated evidence rather than a single film's worth of manufactured chemistry. It is also worth noting how the film handles humor, an element that has always balanced the franchise's more self-serious impulses. While the final reckoning leans more heavily into gravity and sentiment than some earlier entries, it does not abandon levity entirely. Small character beats, particularly involving Benji, provide necessary tonal relief amid the story's heavier thematic material, preventing the film from collapsing entirely into somber self-importance. These lighter moments are fewer and further between than in Ghost Protocol or Rogue Nation. A deliberate choice given the finality of this chapter, but their presence still matters, reminding audiences that even at the end of an impossibly high-stakes saga, these characters remain recognizably, endearingly human. Ultimately, any comprehensive critical assessment of this film must hold to truth simultaneously without letting either cancel out the other. The first truth is that the final reckoning is, in places, an overstuffed, occasionally over-explained screenplay that would have benefited from tighter editing and a more fully realized human antagonist. The second truth is that it is also, in its best sequences, among the most extraordinary pieces of pure physical filmmaking released in recent years, anchored by a lead performance that treats risk, sacrifice, and authenticity not as marketing buzzwords but as genuine artistic principles. Both of these truths are valid, and neither erases the other. This is precisely what makes the film simultaneously frustrating and remarkable, sometimes within the very same scene. So, does the final reckoning stick the landing? The honest answer is mostly, but not without real, legitimate flaws. As a piece of pure physical filmmaking, it is among the most impressive action cinema released in recent memory, anchored by sequences that will likely be studied and referenced by future stunt coordinators and directors for years to come. As a screenplay, it occasionally strains under the weight of its own ambition, delivering exposition where restraint would have served the story better, and offering a compelling but underdeveloped human villain standing in the shadow of a genuinely unsettling artificial one. As an emotional conclusion to 29 years of storytelling, it largely succeeds, honoring its characters and its themes with a sincerity that, even when the dialogue overreaches, never feels cynical or hollow. Critics remain split on where exactly this film ranks within the franchise's 8-film history. And that split itself tells you something important. This is not a film that inspires indifference. It is a film people argue about, defend, critique, and ultimately remember, which is more than can be said for most modern blockbusters that simply pass through multiplexes and streaming queues without leaving a mark. Whether or not Mission Impossible ever returns for a ninth installment. And industry speculation on that question remains ongoing. The final reckoning functions as a fitting, if imperfect, culmination of everything this franchise has represented, the belief that real stakes require real risk, that legacy is built through sacrifice rather than convenience, and that even against impossible odds, and even against a machine that claims to know the future, human choice still matters. That, in the end, might be the most impossible mission of all, and the one this franchise, gloriously stubborn and unwilling to fake it until the very end, chose to accept one final time.